Hello, everybody, and welcome to this new podcast recording episode. We're going to do things a little bit differently. Just this will be a brief audience announcement before we begin properly here. My intention for this style of a recording is going to be a tad different because I want to do a change to how I'm going to upload things and receive monetization and that sort of thing. So, in case the audience was just generally unaware, given my posting history to Substack and YouTube and all that stuff, since my YouTube uploads of Substack articles have generally lagged behind, the way that I'm going to do monetization is purely through the Substack and Buy Me a Coffee monetization pathway. And to support that, I'm going to record podcasts like this one to Substack behind the paywall first, and then they will be available on YouTube at a later time. I think usually, though, for Days of Rage and that sort of live stream stuff, that's still going to be all posted on YouTube, etc. So no worries there if that's the kind of content you're interested in. However, today I'm going to be talking about The Dark Crystal, a Jim Henson movie from 1983, and I have joining me the ever excellent Hitman. How are you today, sir?
Hello, Mandrel. Thank you so much for having me on. Was a great film to watch, and I love discussing it.
Yes. This is one I've wanted to review for a very, very long time, several years now, in fact, because I originally watched this film during the COVID years when there was literally nothing else to do and we were all locked under house arrest. And so, what better way to spend the time than watching, Jim Henson movies, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, when you and me both are in the academic agent or Nima Parvini intellectual circle, or at least were several years ago, and he is a big fan of Jim Henson movies, naturally. And so when you start adding Jim Henson movies to your Amazon or whatever watch list, eventually you'll stumble upon the next piece of content, right? So this movie, I think, needs to be also placed into a bit of timing context as well, because at the time I was about it would have been about halfway between or early 2021, just after Jan 6th, when everybody sort of had a little bit more of there's a huge deflated moment after that point in time. And so everybody was kind of going towards more like perennial or spiritual or broadly this sort of like deep moral content, if you will. And this kind of goes into that for also that era, also for that reason. I think when I was first introduced to this movie, I was about halfway through Revolt Against the Modern World, which is the famous Evola book, the main one. And this film blew me away because when I first watched it, I just thought, this is exactly what Evola's talking about. So that was my first impression. What was your first impression, Hitman?
Oh, well, in terms of my first impression, I only watched the film for the first time a couple of weeks ago, just before Christmas, when you first reached out to me to ask if I was interested. And yeah, it's a film I only really learnt about in the past year because, well, you mentioned AA. AA and Morgoth both made like a meme reference to this film in the course of last year, and that's how I first discovered it. And yeah, I thought it was a really good film. I didn't really see much of Volian connection until you mentioned it. So when I watched it, I saw it more as a traditional, more fantasy film, and I see some very strong parallels to the Lord of the Rings. Not perfect parallels, but there are still parallels there nonetheless. I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yes, it's interesting because, as I understand, the screenwriters and the people who actually created this film, other than Jim Henson, have a connection to this more new agey background, you know, stuff that we wouldn't necessarily be, you know, we wouldn't have nice things to say about that kind of stuff. But I think it's very interesting in its visual aesthetic for that reason, and also for the moral story that it tells to us. And I think that the moral story, broadly speaking, is one which, when I was reading Evola, it struck me as being a pure priestly cast story. It is about the completion of a ritual, which is the attempt to reforge or remake this sort of sacred ritualistic object, which is the Dark Crystal, of course. And I think that one of the more interesting themes to this film is the idea of the unification of two wholes, right? At the beginning of the film, we are introduced to these two races of characters, right? The first one, the more interesting one, I think, is probably the Skeksis, and then the other one is the Mystics, right? And the Skeksis versus the Mystics is an interesting dichotomy, because one of them is like this sort of purely monkish, almost very slow moving, very peaceable sort of race, and the other is this extremely harsh and evil looking and very, obviously bird like in their visual appearance race. And I think this is an interesting dichotomy, because I'm also reminded of pre-Christian social structures, especially ones that George Dumas-Gilles wrote about with the Romans. And I think you could make comparisons there between the Skeksis being a sort of maybe warrior caste and kind of similar to the Lupercali in some, or the Lupercales in some way, and the Mystics being a little bit more like the Flamen, or am I saying that right? The Flamen Dialis, or the Flamen Dialis. So it's very interesting.
Just to add to that, because interesting you mentioned Dumas-Gilles, because Mike from Imperium Press has talked a lot about Dumas-Gilles and Dumas-Gilles' concept of I think it's Mitra Varuna, and he's got his own version of that called the Odinic Enteric. And it's really interesting if you're looking at the Skepsis and the Mystics. The Mystics are very Tyrrhic in the sense that they're very traditional, very sort of orderly and aligned with law, whereas the Skepsis are more Odinic, because like they're much more sort of radical and sort of subversive in a way.
Well, I would not say radical or subversive necessarily. I would say that the Skeksis do have their own formulation for order, but it is a different one. And the main distinction between, and of course, I'm glad that you brought up Mitra Varuna, because this is basically where we get this idea from. This is the more famous exploration of the Lupercales and the comparison with the Flamen Dialis and all of that stuff. But the Flamen Dialis is a priestly caste, right? Historically, they had very specific prohibitions regarding military affairs. Like I think if I remember correctly, they had some very strange ones. Like they couldn't ride a horse. They couldn't visually see an army within a certain radius of a place, and all of these other things. But the point of all of these prohibitions is that this is not a military elite. This is a pure priestly elite. That's the point. Whereas the Lupercales, if you know anything about the Lupercales, you will understand that is a very clearly Odinic warrior elite. So I think from this comparison between the Skeksis and the Mystics and this other social structure, which is given to us in pre-Christian Roman times, you can see kind of what we're talking about here. And the unification of the two wholes is, which is, the entire point of the movie, the entire plot of the movie is the unification of these two kinds of elite. So I think that's a very interesting observation just off the get-go.
No, certainly. And something else which I comes to my mind is you talk about this idea of a priestly elite versus a martial elite. Well, to further reinforce the idea that the Skeptics are martial, of course, when you have because obviously with the Skeptics there's 10 of them, they're led by an emperor who dies very early into the film, and then they have to get a successor. And how they decide it, one of the Skeptics called the Chamberlain puts himself forward, and then he's challenged by another one, and they have to duel over it. Now, it's not a proper duel. What it is they both get a sword, and there's like this big like metal like rod or pole, and they have to, through a display of might, try and destroy it. And because the other Skepticist wins, he becomes emperor, and the Chamberlain is cast out. So again, it's the display of might to prove yourself worthy.
Yes, yes. This is the character who wins is actually called the General. So it's of course even more fitting in terms of the storyline and in terms of martial prowess. Right, you kind of expect the General figure to be the one who actually wins. The trial by combat, the trial by stone, as it were. But I think there's an interesting connection if we could back up just a little bit, because this is very early on in the movie, right? This is like the first 5 or first 10 minutes. The connection between the Skeksis and the Mystics is established very early on, because the Skeksis Emperor dies, and you can actually chronologically it happens at basically at the same time almost as the death of the chief mystic figure. Right, this other mystic figure who is basically like their version of a head priest. I'm forgetting what his actual title is, or his name. There's a lot of characters who make very small, short appearances, but
I think he's just called Master, because that's one of the main characters is this Gelfling called Jen, and he's raised by this this high priest who he just calls Master.
Yes, that's what he's called, the Master. And this connection is established early on because he dies basically almost at the same time as the Emperor. So clearly, when you're watching the movie, there is an obvious dichotomy there, and an obvious connection between these two things. What happens to one also, therefore, must happen to the other. This idea is established just basically immediately in the movie. So that is the subtext of the plot that you're dealing with. This is the mechanism of the entire plot, which is the usage of the dark crystal in a sort of sacred ritual or rite, and the unification of two wholes. So essentially, what is, and also this is established very early on as well, is after the master dies and you're introduced to Jen as a character, as the main character of the movie, really. You basically see the Mystics begin a sort of magical or journey to the Dark Castle, right? The Skeksis fortress, right? Where, and I actually like this fortress a lot, right? It's very striking in the sort of primordial chaos, right? I think the movie does a very good job of creating, especially with the Skeksis territory, but also with some of the animal animatronics and that sort of thing. It gives you a very clear sense of the primordial, right? This primordial chaos. And I think it's very interesting because this sort of primordial chaos and is it's like a progenitor to something else. It's like this storm-racked, cracked wasteland of a landscape, and I think that the Skeksis fortress bears a resemblance, at least to my mind anyway, of something that is found in Warhammer Fantasy, and especially in Warhammer Total War, which is the fortress in the Chaos Wastes known as the Howling Citadel, right? I think it kind of has a slight resemblance to the Howling Citadel, to my mind. But anyway.
Oh, and that's interesting, because in terms of the fortress, I kind of think of it because when you're looking at the Skeksis, I actually see another one of my interpretations of the film. It's almost like the Skeksis are like the ruling elite, because obviously they've got the emperor that rules this post-apocalyptic land. And so, but they are a fallen corrupt elite because again they're hideous. They're not their physiognomy is very very poor. They're ugly bird creatures. They're dressed in this like rotten finery, and they're all like they're all just live in this castle of evil. And it's almost like they're an elite that don't have a noblesse oblige to the world around them. They're just sort of all stuck in their castle reclusives and just doing their own thing really.
Yeah, I think that's one of the early distinctions between the Skeksis and the Mystics, actually, because the Mystic territory is clearly much more pro-natural and pro-nature, because you can see it. They're covered in greenery roughly around them, whereas the Skeksis have this like wasteland landscape, this pure nothing around them except maybe some desert mountains and way off in the distance. So I think that's another symbolic and visual distinction. So you can kind of see who you might say the good of the two are, which is interesting in the pro-nature side of this good and evil dichotomy is the good side. I think that's a very interesting point.
And also, just to add to that, I don't know how familiar you are with the work of the British children's author Roald Dahl, Mandrill, but I see some really strong parallels in the portrayal of the Skeksis compared to a lot of the portrayal of evil characters in Roald Dahl's children's stories, because this is especially helped by his illustrator Quentin Blake. Like Roald Dahl villains are always like Skeksis are very spiky looking. They're really sinister. They're all like, there's a scene where we have the Skeksis. They're having like this feast and they're just disgusting. Like they're slobbering everywhere. There's like food being thrown all about, and that's similar in Roald Dahl. Like his villains are always disgusting and filthy as well. So I just thought it was a very interesting comparison.
Yeah, that is a very interesting comparison. I mean, I'm not super familiar with Roald Dahl. I did read it as a child. It's been many, many years now. But I think in comparison of the Skeksis with evil factions and spiky bits, as we say, to continue with the Warhammer connection here as well, one of the interesting things, of course, is they have these big old bird beaks, right? I thought that was an interesting aesthetic choice because obviously in Warhammer, the Tzeentchian faction is the bird faction of chaos. Like obviously the spiky bits aesthetic is an interesting one too, because they're, chaos notably in Warhammer is always the spiky bits faction. So anyway, that's a very interesting little connection.
Oh yeah, I didn't even think of that, especially with the Raven. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So let's see. We can probably return to the plot at this point. So I think the entire ritual, which is supposed to be completed during the film, uniting good and evil, is called in the film the Great Conjunction, and the way we're introduced to this idea of the Great Conjunction is when Jen goes to visit this Aughra figure. Her name is Aughra. She's like this, you might call her an alchemist or something like that, or an early form of scientist. And she introduces Jen to this idea of the Great Conjunction and essentially gives the hero his quest, right? This is how he knows what he must do. And she also gives him the shard. The shard, which is this piece of the crystal which has to be reunited with the actual ritual object itself. However, there we also have to talk about the prophecy, right? There is this residual prophecy which in universe explains why, partially at least, the Skeksis are so hostile to the Gelflings. And the Gelflings are a third race who kind of were a pre-existing civilization before evil came into the world, basically before the world was shattered by this splitting of good and evil. And Jen is one of two remaining survivors of this race of Gelflings, and he of course, he's a very young child. Basically, at the beginning of the film, it's almost weird, the hero's journey in a way. But like as I said before, it's not your standard typical hero's journey where he's an elite. He is, or a warrior elite, I should say. This is a very priestly story. Violence from the main character really doesn't come into it at all. It's very non-violent in a way. I don't know if you found that significance at all, because I thought that was very notable.
Yeah, and again, just to go back to Lord of the Rings, again, he's very similar to Frodo. Like the Gelflings are very much like hobbits, aren't they? These very short, childlike sort of people. And again, him going on his own. Like Jen and the Gelfling he finds later, Kira, it's again, it's a bit like Frodo and Sam, albeit Kira's a female and not male. But yeah, that's one of the main comparisons I see. And the one difference is obviously Frodo does resort to violence a little bit, but not that much, whereas Jen doesn't too at all.
Yeah, that's the other thing, is that this is there's a sort of unwillingness to. I mean, this is where you can start to see a bit of the shitlibbery kind of maybe creeping in a tad. This idea that you can set the world to rights without force, which I think is kind of defeating the point of the unification of good and evil. That the Skeksis being a warrior elite is that, excuse me, you can't do that without the usage of force, in my view. But maybe that's just me speaking as a decadent warrior elite. Anyway, but I think to move the plot along here, so we can continue. Basically, after Jen comes to Algra's orrery, he is immediately attacked by the Garthim, which is, the Garthim are these like scarab beetle type minions that essentially are the foot soldiers of the Skeksis, right? The Skeksis are always sending them out to go attack the Gelflings or to go seek them out. And they're these gigantic, very awkwardly moving, big sort of bug looking things. And they're very evil looking, aren't they? So it's kind of appropriate that they work for the Skeksis. And this whole idea is that you have to. I'm losing my train of thought already.
Well, one thing I will say is, when I was watching this film, I was actually blown away that it was done in the early 80s, because the effects and the designs and the costumes and everything and the puppets are so well done. I really found a hard time believing it was done in the 80s. I thought it was more made. It almost looks like it was made like more recently.
Yeah, I think that's observations you can make for other movies as well. I find that modern movies overuse CGI, so they almost look cheaper in a way. Like comparing this movie to Lord of the Rings, I think that the usage of animatronics in this film, as well as the usage of actual actors who are costumed and made up, provides a sense of realism, if that makes sense, for fantasy movies. I think that having real costumes and people who are actually playing the part makes movies look or seem more real, and I think it adds to the sense of magic and majesty to high fantasy as a genre in film more than CGI. CGI seems cheap to me. I don't know.
Fundamentally, I think if you use in a limited fashion and correctly, I think it can work quite well, especially with Gollum in The Lord of the Rings or with Davy Jones in the Pirates of the Caribbean films. I think if done correctly and limited, it works fine. But if you abuse it, as Peter Jackson would do to his folly in the Hobbit films, where they just CGI everywhere, I think that's one of the reasons why those films were not as good as the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. But there's other problems with those films as well.
Oh, for sure. And I think that this film has no CGI, so everything when you're looking at it on screen is a real physical object. It's a real puppet, which ironically seems to trick the brain into thinking that it is something real when you watch it. The animatronics in this movie were amazing, because, like, I mean, even in the scenes where you have more, like, they're very short scenes where you have, like, especially when Jen finds Kira, who is the romantic counterpart of the Gelflings to Jen, and she finds her basically living among the podlings, these little, like, hobbit kind of creatures almost. I kind of would dispute your assertion that Jen and Kira are hobbits. To me, they seem, they're short, so they seem to resemble more elves in a classic sense of the word elf.
I suppose
then,
that's fair. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and the pointy ears to me spoke to me more as like, oh, this is like an obvious elf insert, right? They're very skinny, very lithe, despite being short, and their depiction in the film. But the podlings, to me, they're always these very, very short, very rotund in their features characters, right? They look like these little, like, you might even classify them as gnomes, right? And I found that they were very interesting as well, because they're very happy little creatures, and they're the sense of merriment, right? After Jen arrives at the Gelflings, they basically begin to party for no reason at all. They're just these very merry and happy little beings living their way in essentially their version of the Shire. But one of the things regarding the animatronics is that, like, there's a lot of these little scenes that probably are not really so necessary. When Jen meets Kira, he's basically in a swamp, and there was like a little animatronic animals that are just doing stuff on screen, right? And it's almost really unnecessary in a way, because they're extra, if that makes sense. They add to the sense of the primordial ooze and nature of the swamp that Jen finds himself in, but, like, they're almost like not really needed. They're just these little figures moving in the background, almost to give you a sense of, like, comic relief. I'm thinking of this giant, like, sludge monster thing that comes up out of the ooze after Jen meets Kira, and it has, like, a little baby next to it, and it starts mewing, and they're like, that's totally unnecessary. And they're both moving, they're both movable figures, and I just found that fascinating, that there's a lot of stuff that's added in, and what would it would take from a labor point of view and a cost point of view to put all of that stuff in after making it. So anyway, that's a very interesting point there in terms of these little animatronic movies and how you create a sense of magic out of just moving objects, basically.
And also, there's not a need to explain everything. It's just these things are part of the world, and it adds to the mystery and wonder.
Right. I think that's another point as well. Nothing is really explained. The ritual is not explained. The Skeksis and the mystics are not explained. It just is, simply. And I think this is a great example also of show, don't tell. The movie is not a long movie by any means. It's like, 90 minutes, 193 minutes, something like that. And it's a great example of, you don't need a lot of extra filler. This is a pet peeve of mine that I have of a lot of movies these days, which is they just run on and on and on and on. And when they finally get to the ending, you have, like, the third act, or almost a fourth act to the movie, where they add another half an hour to a movie where it doesn't even need that. You need to cut it down, because audiences have very short attention spans. And it just goes to show you at the decline in filmmaking, because everything is I have to tell you instead of show you, when we have to have dialogue and discourse in order for the audience to understand. It's like, no. Show, don't tell. You have the visual medium for a reason.
Just to go back to what I was saying about the Hobbit films, that is a great example of what you've just said, because the Hobbit films were originally going to be only 2, and then they decided to expand it to 3. And the final film, The Battle of the Five Armies, that is literally just the last chapter of the book. So you've taken one whole chapter and turned it into, like, a 2-hour film. It's just completely unnecessary.
Right. And The Hobbit is one book in and of itself. So you conceivably, given the fact that the first 3 Lord of the Rings films were one movie for one book using 2.5, 3 hours, you've proven with that setting, at least, that an audience is more than happy to watch that kind of film if it's well done. But, you know, the anyway, the point is that these sorry, the Hobbit is a pet peeve of mine as well, because it was clearly something that should have been done in one movie and not three. Anyway, but we're getting a little bit far afield here. But I suppose you could, with these sort of high fantasy genres, everything has to be compared to Lord of the Rings at some point, so it's unavoidable. But yeah, the moving on with the story here. So there's this prophecy in the Dark Crystal, which is, I'll read it for you. When single shines the triple sun, what was sundered and undone shall behold the two made one by Gelfling hand or else by none. So, of course, with this sort of Odinic and skaldic idea of poetry being able to create magic or being related to magic, of course, prophecy has to rhyme. This is the proper way of it. And essentially, the Gelflings are chased, not, as I said before, by the Garthim. Because of this prophecy, the Skeksis are basically destroyed Gelfling society, or it's heavily implied that the Skeksis were responsible for the destruction of Gelfling society and the destruction of that civilization. And the prophecy basically is why the Skeksis are so terrified of Gelflings. Famously, when the Gelflings finally meet the Skeksis, the Skeksis actually go insane, and they're like, ah! And they have like a panic attack when they see it, because even though the Gelflings are like these extremely small, good-looking creatures, it's like the opposite of good versus evil and subjectivity, I guess you might say, that the Skeksis, in their own subjective viewpoint, view the Gelflings as evil, because they're just like, oh my gosh, they're so beautiful, they're like these little cute little creatures, like we can't stand it.
Yeah, no, it's like physiognomic kryptonite.
Right. They have like this like extreme overreaction to something that anyway, I just think that's another example of show don't tell, and I'm abstracting what is like a very short little snippet of the movie here. So after, the plot really advances rather quickly. I think one of the audience reactions is that the film is over before you know it. Like, I think this is, as we said, one of the other reason of why this movie is so good is because there's not a minute wasted in the film, right? There's always something happening. The plot is always progressing onwards at every moment. And the next moment, after the podlings are attacked by the Garthim and they basically get captured to be enslaved, Jen and Kira essentially go, they use these things called Landstriders, which are these really weird looking horse equivalents in universe. And right as they do this, Jen and Kira have this like little dog thing called Fizzgig. It's like this little fuzzy ball thing, and they have almost a bit of a romantic moment after they get booted out of the podling shire, basically, and basically Fizzgig starts barking at them as they're about to touch or about to have some sort of contact, and I thought that was a very symbolically interesting little insert there, where the dog is actually rather like a romantic impediment, a romantic obstacle.
Yeah, it's almost like a fairy chaperone.
almost. Anyway, so they basically get on these Landstriders and they go inevitably to the Dark Fortress. And I think it's also interesting because at the same time, the entire story is cut with very small snippets of what's happening to the Mystics, right? The Mystics are, of course, these very slow moving plotting characters compared to the Skeksis, who are very quick and very decisive figures. And at various points in the film, the mystics are cut into the film, and so you can see their journey towards the final destination of the Dark Crystal and the completion of the final rite. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of a Red versus Blue joke, where if for those who are familiar with Red versus Blue, the original season, they have these like basically they make like robot Master Chiefs basically, and they send them in, and the joke is, you said you wanted a day of victory. At this rate of advance, it will take them 24 hours to reach the final location. And it's the same way with the mystics, right? You're like, okay, come on, like it takes you guys forever to get anywhere. But
so just bring up another Lord of the Rings connection. It's very interesting. You can almost draw a comparison between the mystics and the Ents. You know, the Ents taking hours just to say hello in Fangorn Forest.
Right. This sort of naturalistic connection. Elite, I guess, priest-elite certainly seems to take its time. I think that one of the other interesting things, once you actually see, again, throughout the film, is the connection between the mystics and the Skeksis, right? Every single time something happens to the Skeksis, there's a mystic connection, and the equivalent literally happens almost as if it's by magic, right? One of the Skeksis, I think, dies during one of these little intermittent cutscenes, and of course it immediately cuts away to a mystic having the same or similar fate immediately done to them as well, and one of them looks up and says, so it's me now, and he basically like disappears in like a poof of magical energy, just boop, gone. So I don't know, that's a very fascinating little aside as well, these little cutscenes that happen.
Oh, certainly, and it's interesting when you look at how they actually go, because as you pointed out with the mystics, they just kind of fade into a cloud or fade into nothingness. Like when the Emperor dies at the beginning of the film, the Emperor, Skeksis Emperor, he like rots and decays into like dust and ash. And they're saying that whenever the Skeksis die, it's always like this horrible, like their bodies like rot and decay. It's not like a pleasant dissolution of the body where the mystics should just disappear.
Right. So it's roughly at this point that Jen and Kira finally arrive at the Dark Castle, and they see upon arrival that the Garthim are beginning to also arrive, and they are taking the podlings who are going to be slaves into the Dark Castle, and they decide to immediately attack the Garthim and free the podlings while they still have an opportunity. And this goes moderately well, you might say. The podlings are indeed freed, but unfortunately, Jen and Kira basically get cornered off of a cliff edge, which is, of course, as I mentioned before, this sort of racked and fractured landscape of the primordial chaos, and next to the Dark Fortress. And I think this is important because it shows the film that it's dangerous, because you see one of the Landstriders basically gets subsumed by the Garthim, and you can tell it basically dies, and there's a combat there where the Landstriders are basically stomping on the Garthim with their little like hooves and stuff, and it's at this point that Kira and Jen essentially I almost found it Deus Ex Machina in a way, and I also found that it was I guess maybe one of the first obviously points of subversion, at least to our eyes, that you could notice in the film. And it's actually it's a lot more subtle than subversion and feminist inserts these days. But essentially, Jen basically jumps off with Kira off the cliff face down into the canyon, and basically unbeknownst to the audience, Kira has these like little fairy wings, which of course is like an insert and it's totally unexplained in the film, and I just found it was a very bad little plot device. And of course, what she says when they get to the bottom of the canyon is something like, "Oh, silly boy, only girls can have wings," and this sort of thing. And I'm like, oh, that just I found it very cringeworthy. And of course, I rolled my eyes when I saw the film. So, but I thought that was one of the only real obvious like feminist points of the movie, I guess.
Yeah, I did cringe a little bit, but I thought it didn't bother me that much. The only thing I would say is that if they remade this film now, I can imagine them making that scene far more insufferable.
Right, right. There are easy ways in the film where you could you could insert something to break the fall of Jen and Kira, right? Roots or some kind of tree or something. You know, you don't need to give this sort of like Deus Ex Machina, oh, fairy wings out of nowhere. And it's totally unexplained by that point too. Like the fairy wings of Kira are just totally unobservable. It's like the first time you ever see it is in that scene, so which makes it really egregious in terms of storytelling, in my view, because you're not given any foreshadowing, nothing. It's just boop, there they are, and I thought that was really bad. But anyway,
yeah, and also the fact is she never uses them again throughout the whole film.
Right, right. So it's inserted literally for just one scene, which makes it seem like it was there as an insert to give the audience this one line of dialogue. So I don't like that at all. But anyway, so they get into the castle, and of course we did skip ahead a little bit because the Chamberlain, who we were introduced earlier during the trial of Stone, he basically had talked to Jen and Kira earlier when they are introduced to the prophecy in the Gelfling ruins. And of course, they don't trust him really, and of course they shouldn't, because he is a Skeksis, and even though he has been cast out, he is inherently only angling for power again, as a Skeksis is, this sort of extreme Machiavellianism that you might observe. And of course, he is found in attempting to re-infiltrate the Dark Fortress again. And so they find him in the basement of this fortress, and he essentially, tries to. This is the second approach that he makes to them, and they deny him again, and basically don't allow him to get any sort of leverage, or don't like team up with him in any way. And I found it was very interesting because they never trust the evil figure, which is very smart and very intelligent of them to do. Yeah, so it's like you don't ever trust Gollum basically fully.
You can almost say the Chamberlain is like the Gollum of the Dark Crystal. So.
I mean, yeah, definitely. And so, unfortunately, Jen and Kira at that point, they fall into like a pit or into a hole, and that's basically like the equivalent of the Garthim like home or Garthim like bedroom or something. And there's a wonderful scene where they're encapsulated in darkness, and then you just see the eyes peering out of the darkness, and then it's revealed that, oh, this is the lair of the Garthim, and they get obviously captured. And this precipitates basically the rest of the story arc, where Kira is. I thought this was a wonderful insert as well, because there's noticeable in the trial by stone scene, the actual slaves are podlings, and they have this very pallid and milky eye sockets. Essentially, their skin turns a pallid color, and their eye sockets turn all weird. And you see them like pulling and bringing up the stone for the trial by stone. And it's not really fully explained up until this point of how the podlings end up in this sort of like slavish distinction, this sort of like pathetic and totally mindless slave caste, essentially, whereas the podlings are very happy and normal and full of life and vibrancy when they're actually free. So I found that as an interesting little piece of symbolism as well. But the way that this is explained is one of the Skeksis is working on this like magical elixir to provide the emperor, or the former general, as it were, eternal life, or this idea of the ability to extend one's life. And the way that he's doing it is through this kind of alchemical process where the dark crystal is in storage in its little storage pit, I guess, and there's a little like cutout for viewing, and basically the podlings are strapped down to a chair and they're hooked up to like an IV system, and their life force is drained out as they're viewing the crystal, as the crystal is infusing them with its dark and malicious energies. And I thought that was very cool because it just explains how the podlings go from these happy little creatures and have their like literal life force drained. And of course, one of the interesting lines of dialogue is the emperor basically drinks a podling life force, and he gets renewed temporarily, but it doesn't actually work. So there's like this weird magical thing about gelflings, and I think this explains again through showing not telling, one of the reasons for antagonism between the Skeksis and the gelflings is because the gelflings in universe, totally unexplained, their life force is special and allows for the Skeksis to actually acquire extended life. I think that's a very interesting little point as well.
And also very much nods to the idea that they're elves, because remember, the elves are immortal or very long lived in fantasy in general. So
right. And I found it very interesting. Anyway, but this kind of gives us a little bit of natural plot tension, because Kira is eventually, after she's captured, she's strapped into this chair, and Jen has to basically complete she basically has to complete the ritual, but in actuality there's a bit of he doesn't help her at all in escaping. Really, the way that she escapes is because Augra essentially somehow enters the Dark Fortress unbeknownst to everybody else. Somehow she's just like she's basically wandering around and somehow ends up in prison. And in the Skeksis dungeon, she basically I might be misremembering here, but somehow the animals escape and help Kira also escape during the ritual scene when she's basically having her life force drained. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's very interesting because, again, I talked earlier about this idea of the Skeksis being like a corrupt, decadent elite, but with this idea of eternal life, it's almost like they're a gerontocracy, like an aging, like elite, horrible, like ruling class that just sap the lifeblood out of the youthful underlings. And you can draw on certain comparisons between current real world elites if you want to take it in that direction, because it does remind me, because I mentioned there were a couple of memes that A.A. Morgoth had shared. Well, one of them was at the clip where the Emperor dies and he just does that final shriek, and A.A. just said, behind the scenes footage of Joe Biden.
I'm still
it's like when they give the new Emperor, the general, the podling like life force. It's like that's what they give to Joe Biden before he goes on stage to give a speech or a talk. It's just inject him with some like xenoplasma or something, and he'll be all right.
Yeah. It's the adrenochrome, right? That's what it is. Anyway, so I think also the captive animals actually are able to break free, and that's essentially the mechanism that Kira uses to escape, which I find interesting because it also has parallels in folklore. Really, there's this idea of the helpful animals in folklore, and so I thought that was a nice symbolic touch as well. Basically, the alchemist gets pushed into you might even say Emperor Palpatine style into the pit of the Dark Crystal. So there's also a little bit of a Star Wars symbolic parallel there as well.
Well, to do another Lord of the Rings comparison, you can almost think of it's a bit like that lava in the middle of the Dark Fortress. It's a bit like Mount Doom, isn't it? Where they throw the ring in.
Yeah. And the comparison also with the Gollum figure as well. Although it's the alchemist, not the Chamberlain who gets pushed in necessarily. Anyway, but one of at this point you have the Great Conjunction, and this is the most poignant part of the movie, which is the actual ritual itself. And this is one which I think is probably has the greatest symbolic significance of the whole movie, and it's the entire point of the movie. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the Evolian themes about the Great Conjunction. And I think one of the interesting parts is that I was noticing when I first watched it is the idea of the ritual space, which is essentially a circle with a sacred object in the middle, in which the rite has to be completed essentially concentrically around it. And naturally, this rite is the reunification of a broken object into a whole, which is taking the crystal shard and placing it into the dark crystal itself. So the completion of the ritual object in proper order at the correct time. And I think there's also a little bit which could be said as well, because Kira somehow makes it up into the ritual chamber, and Jen is there as well. The Garthim are brought in once the Skeksis realize, because they're all assembled in their places around the Dark Crystal to perform this ritual. And Jen comes in and they all panic, and there's this funny little moment where they see finally the Gelflings, and they're all like, "Ah, Gelflings!" Ah! And they all start running around the ritual chamber like higgledy-piggledy, and it's just complete bedlam for a couple seconds. And the Garthim are just running around like, waving their tendrils and incompetently, and it's just a very funny little scene. And somehow the podlings are like, all excited up in the viewing gallery. It's very funny. Did you have any thoughts about that?
No. Again, just again the over the top reactions of the skepsis. Again, as I said, physiognomic kryptonite. The natural good and beautiful repels the repulsive and evil.
Yes. Well, I think at this point, Jen, he basically starts getting chased around by the Garthim, and in the final moments of the film, he essentially jumps on top of the Dark Crystal itself, but he drops a piece of the shard, and it somehow avoids. Of course, this is part of the movie, right? It doesn't actually go into the dark, deep pit and lands in the ritual space next to Kira, who has gotten herself into the ritual chamber. Unfortunately, she picks up the shard, and I forget which Skeksis it is exactly, but one of them comes around with a knife and basically stabs her, and she falls. But before she collapses on the floor, she throws the shard up onto the dark crystal, and Jen catches it and it completes the ritual by placing the shard into the crystal. And of course, at this point, all of the mystics have thoroughly arrived. As all of this bedlam has been going on, they have slowly and surely, and to add to the sense of bedlam, they've arrived inside of the mystical chamber and all taken their ritual places in around the crystal. And so once the shard is placed into the crystal, and the heavens have aligned, literally, right? That all of there's this idea, you can see it in the earlier ritual of the sun that the Skeksis did in the first moments of the movie, that the heavens are slowly aligning to the Great Conjunction, where all of the stars, all of the planets have all come into alignment, and now is the time where we must complete this ritual. And so everything is now properly in place. And of course, Jen puts it into the crystal, and the Skeksis are ever so slowly drawn into, as almost by tractor beam, because they're all pointing away. They're trying to get away. They don't want to be drawn into the crystal or into the mystics. And so the mystics and then the Skeksis magically get subsumed into each other. And then, they become this creature known as the Ur-Skeks, right? And I found it very fascinating as well, the symbolic choice for the Urskeks, because they're these creatures of light, but they almost have this to your point of earlier about the Ents, they have like this tree appearance. So I found that very interesting, that the ultimate good is natural and naturalistic.
Yeah, they're certainly. They also have got very spectral appearance as well.
Yes, they do. They're very glowing, and they're golden. And I think one of the interesting things as well, which is something which might not be exactly a popular viewpoint, but the idea of the necessity of sacrifice. Obviously, the mystics and the Skeksis are all basically get consumed by the ritual, and the unspoken aspect of this whole thing is the sacrifice of Kira. I think that it's not really explained that this is a necessity as part of the ritual, but I make connections to this because obviously of my spiritual outlook. And Kira essentially, her blood is shed at the penultimate moment of the ritual, really, when the actual thing kicks off in earnest. And it's kind of implied that she dies and is revived by the actual completion of the ritual and the arrival of the Ur-Skeksis. And she basically collapses. Jen picks her up and takes him in his arms. Then the Ur-Skeksis basically give him this little speech about, it's very loving and tender. I forget the exact words, but essentially, carry her with you and that sort of thing. And so he cuddles her, and almost as if by love itself, she is revived. So I found that as one of the a very awesome part of the movie.
Yeah, no, it's very very wholesome in there, certainly.
But yeah, anyway, the idea of the necessity of sacrifice is one which I found to be a fascinating part of the movie, and it's not really stated that this is, as I said before, like a total necessity, but it's kind of implied. So I don't know. It's a lot of people would probably say that wasn't important, but I kind of think that that was an unspoken requirement, if as it were.
Well, that's a very interesting reading, because I didn't quite read it that way, so it's so interesting you brought that up.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the other fascinating things as well is after this ritual has been completed and you get to the ending credits, one of the little observations that you can make at the ending credits is the change in the landscape. You're given a scene of beauty and splendor. There's a river that's now flowing through the landscape. The landscape has therefore become green, and the Dark Fortress has now become a fortress of light. It is now a silver tower instead of a black and twisted, sort of place of darkness and evil. And I found that very interesting from a Spenglerian point of view, because there's almost a sort of connection in my mind, at least, that the completion of this ritual is implied to be what brings on and creates the springtime. And you are going from winter to the springtime, right? The sort of dead and lifeless environment into the aliving of the world, you might say.
No, certainly, and it's one thing I will say, if we're talking about Spengler, is I have a very Magian conception of the Dark Crystal, especially if you're looking at these ideas of good and evil, because one thing Spengler talks about, especially when you're looking at the idea of a Magian civilization, is the Magian culture or Magian civilization has this idea of moral duality, the ultimate good and the ultimate evil, which is manifested in the mystics and the skepsis. Though one thing that is different is the film results in their reunification into one new being rather than the continuation of this perpetual conflict.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest observation. I would disagree that it's Magian in this way. To me, this is kind of, I mean, not kind of. It's exactly what Bowden said about that good and evil should go together. So that's what my interpretation of it when I watched it is, that this is the natural course of events, and how you actually create a new paradigm, a totally new paradigm. And in my view, it is rather cyclical, because you go from the primordial chaos to the actual literal springtime. And I mean, of course, I haven't read Decline of the West yet, unfortunately, at this point. But so I can't speak to Magian civilization. And I kind of refuse to watch your podcast on it with Hungry the Die Merchant so far, because I refuse to watch people's takes before I actually engage with the work now. But I find that it's deeply perennial in its viewpoint, I would say. I think that is the proper interpretation. It's not explicitly doctrinal or religious in an organized sense, but it is very, very, very deep themes and these very deep impulses, I would say. And this kind of idea that good comes from deep places, and in a naturalistic way, not in deep as in a dark, cavernous way, you might say.
Certainly. And to go along with this idea of perennialism, one aspect I think that's quite clear in the film is this idea of restoration, the restoration of the crystal, the restoration of the Earthskex, of the properly divine governing elite of the world. Everything is being put to right, so to speak, which is quite interesting, because that's, in one way, is actually something that you can compare to Lord of the Rings, because ultimately, in the main way of restoration in Lord of the Rings is you have the restoration of Aragorn as king, the return of the king, but also one thing that is different is that in Lord of the Rings, they are destroying the One Ring, whereas in the Dark Crystal, they're restoring the crystal. So it's interesting, these contrasts between creation and destruction. And ultimately, the evil forces in Lord of the Rings are destroyed, along with the ring. They're not redeemed or restored in any way.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, that's interesting as well. I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Well, another film, actually, which I want to draw some comparison to is, have you seen the 1981 film Excalibur at all?
Yes, of course.
Good, because another comparison you can also draw with this idea of restoration is, of course, in that film, you've got the quest for the Holy Grail in order to restore Arthur, from his sickness, in order to win the final battle.
Yeah, I mean, this is, you might even say that this film culturally is part of this 1980s sword and sorcery, high fantasy genre, right? And so there are a lot of comparisons between other movies which could possibly be made. I hesitate to compare it to something like Conan, because Conan is the story of a warrior elite, not a priestly elite. And this is a pure priestly caste story. And I think there are comparisons which you could make, maybe to a little bit of the Black Cauldron in a way. The Black Cauldron, in my view, is kind of that's also it's a 1980s movie. It's a Disney animated film, of course. And that's a combination of a bit of Welsh mythology and a warrior and a priestly elite in combinatory form. But of course, that movie also has the completion of a ritual and using a sacrificial victim in a ritual space with a central object as the mechanism by which the story is completed. So, like, that's a comparison to make there. there's another film off the top of my head that I'm immediately forgetting, but a lot of these genres of movies have very, very similar themes, and I think there's a reason why the 1980s had such a magical element to their filmmaking. And I think that the maneuvering back to these sorts of primordial religious themes uh, and magical themes, I guess, if you were in these heroic stories, that's something that we should probably get back to for sure.
No, certainly. One can only hope that Hollywood moves in that direction with the present cultural vibe shift. So one can only hope.
Well, I think they'll be pushed into it financially after a competitor arrives to usurp them, and maybe that's to give us a little bit of a mythical comparison to this movie here. You might say that that there needs to be a sort of creative destruction where the good and the evil forces basically are subsumed, and then the rightful ruler arises out of the ashes of the winter and the wasteland and that sort of thing. And I think that that's probably the most likely outcome.
Mm. No, certainly. Well, it will remain to be seen in the course of time.
Certainly. Well, with that, do you have any other observations on this film?
Mm. I think I've gone through all of the main points I wanted to uh, bring up. Really, the only thing I would say is it'd be interesting to watch some of Jim Henson's other films, because I also know he did Labyrinth, which I've never seen, and I know that's also a fantasy film. So sadly can't draw any comparison to his other work. I think the only other Jim Henson film I've seen, I think, was actually the Muppets Christmas Carol, but that was a very, very long time ago.
That's funny because yes, I've also watched the Muppets: A Christmas Carol when I was a child, and during COVID I did watch Labyrinth. That is also one which you could conceivably make comparison to as well. Which, I mean, just all '80s movies have this sort of very magical and mystical thing, and there's always this moral challenge that the main character has to do. And I think that's one of the reasons why '80s movies are so near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, even if they weren't actually kids watching these movies in theaters at the time. I think there's a reason why these kinds of movies speak to people. And I mean, in terms of comparison, like the stories are very, very different. I think one of the fascinating notes about The Dark Crystal is how dark of a film it is. It's not really the kind of material you would expect to be in a children's movie, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why financially it didn't gross maybe as much as it could have. I think, and certainly not as much as maybe I'm not an expert on these things, but probably not nearly as much as a Disney film. And of course, speaking of the Black Cauldron, that film was which has some of the same themes, was a financial failure, if I'm not mistaken, or not a financial success considered as such in Hollywood. And I think that these sorts of very dark, perennial themes, right? These things, they do have a sort of meaning to them, but they don't actually speak to the majority. I think this is these are themes which speak to a very a small segment of the population, at least at present. However, one of the other interesting things I think that you can make comparisons is that aesthetically, the film is very like pink, and so I think just from a color palette perspective, this, and of course with the fairies and all of that stuff and the fairy wings, this is a very feminine oriented film in a way. At least that's the vibe, the general vibe that I got from it. And I think that there's a reason why people who are like maybe the childless elder Gen Xers or boomers would watch this film and enjoy it, because of course some of the people who, like I said before, were involved in this making this film were kind of more hippie-ish. So there's the color palette is different for that reason. I think that this was a very odd movie in terms of its color palette. Very, very feminine in that way, which maybe, considering that this is a Priestley cast story, makes a little bit of sense. But maybe I'm just speaking as somebody who's a bit more warrior cast oriented.
I don't know if it's the what's it, the solar masculine versus the lunar feminine.
Yes, yes. I think other observations to be made here. I wonder, firstly, the symbolic similarity of Aughra to certain Negroid forms, and this sort of wizened sort of this sassy black. I mean, she looks like, a Shaboon. The body shape is very similar, I have to say. So it is a bit subversive. Sorry, I forgot about this part until now, but it is kind of subversive that it's, instead of a wise old man figure, it is a wise old woman figure, and a dark skinned, obese shaped woman. So I wonder if that type of person, this sort of shitlib kind of person, makes a mistake with this style of character, and assumes, because obviously they think that black people are magical. This is very clear now, and one of the reasons why that they make these associations is because of movies like this, and the symbolic subversion, maybe you could say. I think one of the other things too is maybe the ritual in and of itself. They in their own mind, these two races being subsumed together, they would make, in boomer fashion, in universalist, anti-racial boomer fashion, they see the unification of these two wholes, in a way, as the unification of the white and the black population. I think that perhaps in their mind, that is the miscegenation is therefore something which is sacred, because that's exactly what they think that they're doing. Anyway.
Well, that's interesting, because something else that's come to my mind is, obviously we've mentioned Spengler, mentioned Evola. Another person that AA talks about in his book Prophets of Doom is Pitirim Sorokin. Are you familiar with him at all?
In passing, I haven't read Prophets of Doom yet, unfortunately.
Well, after reading Prophets of Doom and that chapter, I actually went off and read the abridged Cultural and Social Dynamics by Sorokin, and yeah, his work's fascinating, but I see a little bit of Sorokin in this film, actually, because Sorokin has got this idea that in human culture there are two characters. There is what he calls so there's sensate, and then there is ideational. To be as simple as I can, sensate has style but no substance, whereas ideational has substance but no style. And when these two elements in human culture are harmonized, you get you have what he calls idealized culture, and he argues that idealized culture, idealistic culture, sorry, not idealized, idealistic culture, the harmonization of sensate and ideational is the best culture. And so I feel like when looking at this film, the mystics being very primitive, kind of very in tune with nature, often the rural sticks, are like the ideational elite. The skepsis up in their tower and their rotten finery with all their weird contraptions and their feasts are the much more sensate. And so when they're harmonized into the Urskeks, we've replaced the two ideational and sensate elites with a idealistic elite.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like the mystics. Well, I shouldn't say like. I find that the mystics, as a comparison, a symbolic comparison, are pretty much the archetype, you might say, of, at least symbolically, of the boomer conception of good. This idea of being very pro-nature, being totally non-violent, um, and it's almost like oddly utopian in a way. This idea of combination between the actual physical hard warrior power with this sort of like more caring and naturalistic and you might say magical or mystical, peaceable elite priestly caste. I this never seems to me to be something which can be maintained for a long time. It always seems to constantly have to be renewed, which is part of the story, obviously. But I think there's a reason why these things have to be renewed over and over again, is because these two wholes are like almost oil and water in a way.
Mm. No, I can. Now you mentioned it, I can kind of see where the boomer worldview is sort of leaked into the film a bit.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Um, well, I'd have no further thoughts. So, do you have anything else as a last point?
No, I think we've been pretty thorough, and I've aired all my thoughts. So,
Okay. Well, do you have anything to share, sir?
yes, my channel where I try to do weekly streams. I've actually in a couple of weeks, on the 21st of January, I'm going to be joined by Semiagog. We're going to be discussing the book The Anglo-American Establishment by Carol Quigley. So if you're interested in the late British imperial elite, go give that a watch. So
Yes, of course. You are very, very thorough in your foreign policy deep knowledge and reviews. Uh, of course, if that's something that interests you, yes, you should absolutely go subscribe to Hitman's YouTube channel. Um, as for me, obviously, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm on Gab for those who actually use Gab. Um, you can subscribe to my Substack. You can subscribe to my YouTube. As far as content production and monetization, like I mentioned before, this is going to go up behind my paywall on Substack probably about a week beforehand, and then the week after it'll be released on YouTube and of course released from behind the paywall for non-patrons. Of course, as previously mentioned with all of my other streams, yes, you can patronize me by paying for my Substack subscription, and you can also visit Buy Me a Coffee if you want to make one-time donations. Um, and of course, I this will be released about a week afterwards for the non-paying folks. And also, I'm going to be continuing my series on Days of Rage. The next chapter, I think I'm going to be doing with Prudentialist, and that should be coming out within the next week or so. So do be on the lookout for that. It will be arriving soon. So with that, I think we can go ahead and conclude the stream and have a wonderful rest of your day and enjoy the film. Do go watch this film. It's an excellent film for what it is.
yeah, absolutely. Everybody go give it a watch.